Hi, everybody. My name is Jennifer Wilson, and I'm the Director of Programming and Advocacy with NEMA. Thanks so much for joining us today for this RACS lunch. We are going to get started. I'm going to read our land acknowledgement, and then I'm going to hand it over to our RACS Chair, Emily. So NEMA's land acknowledgement is, virtual spaces cannot replace the lands that sustain and empower us. Today, I'm based out of Pawtucket, Rhode Island, the homelands of the Wampanoag people and their allied tribes, past and present. NEMA recognizes that our organization and those of our members were founded within a colonizing society, which continues the exclusions and erasures of many Indigenous peoples throughout the New England area and beyond. I'll drop this link in the chat, but you can use the Indigenous Peoples land map to locate the lands where your museum is located and where you're zooming in from today. So I'll drop that in 1 second. And again, thank you to everybody for being here today. And I'm going to hand it over to Emily Pierce-Siegerman, our RACS Chair.
I am thrilled to introduce our speaker today. Eli Boyne is an NEDCC Preservation Specialist that provides consultations, training programs, assessments, and disaster assistance to cultural heritage organizations nationwide, with a focus on the Midwest and Southeast regions of the United States. She has a combined 10 years of experience working in museums, archives, and libraries, and since joining NEDCC, has completed a number of assessments, webinars, and hands-on workshops. Eli earned an MA in Library Science from the University of Iowa and an MFA in Book Arts from the University of Iowa's Center for the Book. So join me in welcoming Eli.
Thank you so much. Thanks so much for the warm welcome. I'm really happy to be here today and to meet all of you virtually. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and get our slides up here for today. So let's see here. Just out of the way. Okay, so hopefully we should be ready to go. So like Emily mentioned, thank you. My name is Eli Boyne. I'm a preservation specialist at NEDCC. And if all of you aren't familiar with NEDCC, we are a conservation center that's located in Andover, Massachusetts. But like Emily mentioned, we do work nationwide. And so I'm actually based in New Orleans. I work remotely for NEDCC. And NEDCC has a lot of different ways that we work with conservation and preservation. We might be best known for our book and paper conservation that we do, but we also do audio reformatting and audio preservation and digital reformatting. In my department, Preservation Services, we work with many different institutions and help people do exactly what our webinar is today, which is writing your preservation plan. So with that, I won't take up too much time on all those things, so I'm just going to go ahead and dive in here. And I'm going to turn off my video so we can all concentrate on the slides and be able to view those clearly. So let me just go ahead and do that. Okay. So before we get started, I want to call attention to this link that we see here on the screen. And this is a link specifically for our presentation today. And I'll go ahead and I'll drop that into our chat as well. And so here at this link, you'll be able to see all of our handouts that we'll be talking about today during our webinar. You'll also have copies of our slide deck. And then there also are a couple other resources there. And so I highly encourage you to check it out. This is where, if there's something that you missed on the slides or there's a link that you wish, oh God, how do I click on that? This is where you'll be able to hopefully be able to have all those resources and follow up with this webinar later. And so with that said, let's go ahead and get started by looking at today's agenda. And so we're going to begin today's webinar by talking about what exactly preservation planning is. And so what are some crucial practices to follow to make sure you're addressing your collection's needs? So in this first part, we'll go ahead and outline that. Next, we'll talk specifically about general preservation assessments. And so here we're going to take a look at some of the specific areas of the collection that you can examine to gather information that then you can use in your plan that you'll write. We'll then think about priorities. And so how can we take a look at all the preservation needs that we've gathered through our assessment and then prioritize that information into short, medium, and long-term actions? So in that third part, we'll talk about prioritization. And then last, we're going to get into the nitty-gritty of writing a preservation plan. And so we'll break it down into its components and outline some steps to take to both write and implement your plan. And in this section, we're going to see some sample pages from different templates that you can use to write your plan. So we'll take a look at those more closely. So with that, let's go ahead and get started. So first, let's take a look at the question we see here. What is preservation planning? So Sherilyn Ogden defines preservation planning as a process by which general and specific collection care needs are determined, priorities are established, and resources for implementation are identified. And so we know first that preservation planning is a process. We know that it can be really hard to find time to think about preservation, especially if you work at a smaller institution or maybe you have many immediate needs in your collection that need to be addressed. And so we know that preservation is not a one-off action that has a definite endpoint. Instead, it's something that we're always in the midst of making adjustments to, we're finding funding for, and we're planning for. And so writing your preservation plan, it's going to help you do this systematically. It takes a holistic view of your collection, and then it outlines your needs into actionable steps. It also assists you in getting buy-in from your administrators and any grantors that you might be working with. And these are important groups that can often influence the budget of your preservation planning, or groups that you might have to work with for some of the larger big ticket items that you have to do. Having a preservation plan in place, it helps show these groups, as well as your staff, the steps that you plan to take, and then the timeline of your actions, and also the broad perspective and priorities of how you're addressing preservation in your organization. It's also important to note that this is a process that you do not complete alone. And so preservation, we know, involves many different staff members, be that curators or archivists, department heads, facilities workers, and also your administration or your board. And so if it's possible, your preservation planning team should include a wide range of staff members who are responsible for collections care at your institution. It should also be supported by your administration or your board of directors, as it can be difficult to implement the plan without their commitment to it. Like I mentioned just a little bit ago, your preservation plan is going to define a course of action. And so while we might feel a sense of urgency to do everything right away, your preservation plan outlines the overarching path that you can follow, and you can stretch that path over the next 5 to 10 years. And so with this plan in place, it allows you to see the big picture so you can best use your resources. And it also helps you to prioritize your actions and address them realistically in accordance with the resources that you have, be that time or staff or training or budget. It also identifies specific actions that you're able to take and those that you'll probably never take. And so your resources can be allocated appropriately. And so the planning process that you go through, it results in a written long-range preservation plan. And so this is a working tool that charts your course of action to meet your overall preservation needs. It provides the framework and the context that's necessary to meet these goals effectively in a logical and in an efficient manner. And it also helps you to maintain consistency and the continuity of your goals over time. Since this is a written document, it carries some weight with it also, just like your acquisition or your collection development policies maybe, and it works in tandem with those policies that you already have in place. And so when you have a plan written out, it really validates the role that preservation plays in your institution, and it justifies the resources needed to carry out the plan that you have. So with all of that said, how exactly do we accomplish writing a preservation plan? And so the first step for writing your plan is conducting a preservation needs assessment. And so this is an evaluation of your infrastructure that you have in place. be that administrative or intellectual, like intellectual control, or the physical infrastructure that you're using, maybe for storage or housing and things like that. And so these things are addressed in order to determine how your current practices are working and what your needs are. Your assessment is going to help you determine both the holistic and specific needs of your collection. And so we know that it's useful to think big first. And so think about the policies that you may or may not have in place, or maybe your budget and your staffing, and also your building holistically. Then you can start to narrow your observations down into perhaps maybe the room that stores your collections or the specific formats that you have in your collection. And of course, an assessment also surveys your current practices that you have in place. And so these are things that maybe you're already doing and also the things that you're not doing. These aspects are laid out in observations that you'll write down for your assessment that you then use to determine the needs of your collections. Once you have all your observations written down, you then think of recommended actions that will address those needs. And so remember again that preservation is a core service in a heritage institution. Doing preservation work is part of our role as cultural stewards. Sometimes, this core service, it can feel so ubiquitous that we don't even see it around us. And so during the assessment, this is our time where we can really take some time and try to see things with fresh eyes. We want to observe and look into places, materials, and policies that maybe you haven't approached in a while. Once you've completed your assessment, you can then start prioritizing. And so your assessment gives a huge amount of information about your building, your staff's capacities and limitations, as well as the preservation needs of your collections. And so now with all of that information collected, you can use that to begin planning your path forward. And so when you do this, you'll think about the things that you can do in the short term, things you can do in the midterm, and then things you can do in the long term. And always remember that the goal of your plan is to cover a 5 to 10 year frame. And so thinking of these priorities, what are some of the low cost or no cost activities that maybe are more easily achievable, things that you can kind of quickly cross off your list? But then also on the other hand, what are some projects that are going to require some significant time and funding to complete? What goals that you have can be met in-house, and what might require outside vendors or treatment? We're going to talk, we're really going to get into the nitty-gritty of this, and we'll talk more about how to prioritize these activities later in our webinar today. And so step 3, last step here. So with your assessment complete and your materials prioritized, you can then move on to write your plan. And so here you'll gather all those resources that you've created in your assessment and your planning phases, and then you'll refine that information into specific needs and actionable steps. Timelines and action plans, they'll really make concrete your preservation priorities and make them visible to those who will both be executing them and supporting them. And again, remember that it's best to do this with input from collection care staff and also your administration board. So when timelines start to come together, it might become evident that the institutional timeframes might not match up with your preservation ones. And so during all phases of your planning, you want to make sure that you're working together with a representative group of people. So priorities, resources, and timelines are really clear. Okay. So with all those general steps outlined, let's start looking at them in more detail. Namely, here are the steps to take when performing a general preservation assessment. So we're going to go ahead and start with that, as we can see here on the title of the slide. So again, we know that jumping into preservation planning can be really overwhelming. And we often have this urge that we see so much to do and we just want to do everything at once. And so by breaking things down into manageable steps, we can make note of our observations, start to collect information around us, and then be able to prioritize those actions and write our preservation plan. So as you start your preservation assessment, you might be wondering, what are the questions I should be asking? What are some things that I should be taking note of or be aware of when it comes to preservation? And so again, we know that we want our plans to be comprehensive and really include all of our organization's collections. And so what would be the best approach to recognizing your institution's various preservation needs? And so here on this slide, we can see NEDCC offers its free online textbook for Preservation 101 on its website. And I wanted to put in a plug here for recommending to check this out. And so this is a comprehensive resource that can really introduce you to ways to look at your building, various formats that you have in your collections, disaster planning, among other objectives. If you haven't seen our course before, the online textbook for it is really such a valuable resource. But the great thing about this course can be accessed from the link that we see here on the screen. So this is chapter 9 of the online textbook. And in that chapter, we introduce the preservation assessment. And so I'm going to go ahead and drop this link into the chat. And so as part of this assessment process, NEDCC offers links to worksheets that can be used as you approach your various preservation issues. And so here on the screen, we see the worksheet provided for the first part of an assessment, which is performing an institutional overview. And so that is, what are some of the basics about your institution? What is its size, your mission, your number of staff, et cetera. Overall, as part of this chapter, there's 11 worksheets, and these cover broad topics. And then there's also a number of worksheets that cover really specific collection formats. And all of these are offered through the Preservation 101 textbook. And so each of these is just a few pages long, and they really zero in on questions to ask when covering different aspects of your assessment. And so, you know, this is not the only way to perform a preservation assessment. There's other ways that you can do it. But the worksheets that are offered here, they help you break down your planning into these manageable steps that we keep talking about. And also the worksheets can be accomplished by different staff members or at different points in time. So again, this makes this a more practical process that makes it less likely to overlook important preservation issues. And so what exactly are some of the issues that you should be looking at when you're performing an assessment? And so over the next few slides, I'm going to take a look at some of the biggest areas to assess. And so first, as we see here, collection management is a big one. And so as we saw with the first worksheet, your institutional overview is just the first step when it comes to analyzing the big picture of what your institution is and the collection that it holds. And so here on the screen, we see 3 areas to assess when thinking of collection management. You'll want to think first about all the policy underpinnings of your collection. And so, for instance, what is your mission statement? And if you don't have one, how can you write one? It's always best to make sure you have a mission statement that supports the preservation of your collections. Again, we want to make sure that's really baked into our mission here, so that way we can, use that to show to our administrators or grantors that this is a key goal for our department or for our organization. Think also about any collection development or selection policies that you might have in place, and any other documentation that you're using related to your collection, maybe like donor agreements or access and use policies. In this part, you can begin to gather your documents and review them, see maybe where materials could be updated or what might be missing that needs to be addressed. As we see in the second category here, staff and budget. And so we know that taking a look at these items, it's not just about hard numbers, but we want to think about efficiency as well and updating any job descriptions if necessary and doing training for staff. For the long term, it can be good to think about any additional staffing that might be needed to carry out some of your long-term goals. So for instance, if you work in an archive, do you have a full-time archivist on staff? Or maybe you're thinking about digital preservation and need some volunteers to help with a digitization project. Addressing these issues in your preservation plan can really help you with that long-term planning needed to achieve your goals. And last, we see here intellectual control. And so do you know where the materials in your collection are located? And what kind of data do you have about your collections? This doesn't necessarily have to do with how deeply your collections are described or processed. So for instance, if you have an inventory or maybe legacy descriptions, or maybe part of your collection is in a processing backlog, all of that is fine. You know, with all this, we don't expect you to be perfect, and we don't want to approach this as like, oh, I should have had all this done. We really want to find out exactly where we are at this moment. And these are things that you'll make note of in your assessment. You also might make note of some of the materials that have been described really granularly at the item level, and that it might make sense in the future to do any processing more at the box level in aggregate, for instance, just thinking about, you know, the amount of resources you have, be that staff or time, or the kinds of processing workflows that you have in place. Remember, again, just like I just said, the goal here is not to judge or feel overwhelmed by the amount of work that you think needs to be done. Instead, you want to take stock exactly of where you are at this moment in time, so you can best evaluate your situation and then plan for the future. For a next area of your assessment, you'll next want to take a look at your building and the environment. And so again, at the link that we can see here in the chat, NEDCC has worksheets that has specific questions to address with these different assessment areas. And so we know taking a look at your building and environment, it can guide you to some preventative tools that can have a really broad preservation impact on your collection. And so when you're assessing the building or the environmental controls that you currently have for your collection, one thing you want to think about is risk mitigation. And so this is a term that's often used in emergency preparedness. The idea is to mitigate risks that stem from the terms that we see identified here on this slide. And so to do a risk assessment or think about risk mitigation, you'll want to perform a walkthrough of your building and suss out where your biggest risks might be. Maybe be that with rooms that maybe are too humid, or maybe you have a specific room where sunlight streams in on your collections, or maybe there's some weak security measures in place that might need to be addressed. And so again, taking a look at these things holistically, it really helps you to identify potential actions, which you can then prioritize for improvement. In this section, you'll also want to think about disaster planning strategies or any disaster plans that you may or may not have, and any preventive maintenance that might be regularly performed on your building, like annual roof inspections. We know, again, our daily lives in these buildings can often cause us to overlook things that have really become normalized in our surroundings. And so, you know, maybe there's like always a crack that you walk past, or you're like, oh, the roof's been leaking for, 8 years. It's just something that happens here. Again, try to look at your building and your collection's surroundings with fresh eyes, and make note of both the preservation actions that you have in place and those that would be necessary to have. Moving on to think about the storage and handling of your collections. And so here it's best to take a close look at the materials in your collection, the current storage space that you have, and any available space that you have for your collections. When assessing storage and handling, try to come to a good understanding of what the ideal storage might be for your collections, dependent upon the formats that you have, the size of materials in your collections, and also the temperature or other building conditions that might be necessary for effective preservation. And so to do that, you might ask the following questions. And so first, is my furniture suitable for my collections? Can I optimize the use of my existing storage furniture, or is new storage furniture needed? We know, for instance, oversized collections can present a real set of challenges when it comes to storage. And so oftentimes furniture for oversized materials is a big obstacle here. Second, do I have the space needed in my collection to safely move my collection materials? And are there areas where these collections can be safely handled? Are there materials that are stored in non-collection areas, such as offices? Or maybe our collection areas cluttered with unnecessary materials, like things that you're storing or cleaning supplies, things like that. A big question to ask is, will a renovation be needed to store these materials safely? And last, what are the formats of my collections and what storage conditions are necessary for their care? So with this question, we know that AV can really be a big one here. And so many AV collections need to have cool to cold storage for their preservation. Or there's certain materials, they might need to be rehoused to best store them, which we know will add some profile to the object and will take up some more space. And so what are some specific collection needs that might need to be addressed in that kind of way? During this part of your assessment, you want to address the general state of all of your collections, and what is needed to improve that state and how to best preserve the collections long term. And so again, our assessment worksheets, there's several of them. There's one for collection storage, there's one for collection storage, care and handling, one for also for collections environment. And again, these are found in that chapter 9 of the Preservation 101 online handbook at the link that we see in the chat. And this is really going to help you perform this task. There's also specific worksheets that you can use designed for formats like AV or bound materials or oversized materials that you can use to examine specific areas of your collection. Okay, and then last, the activities in your preservation program, they might be supported and informed by other programs that you might have going on in your organization, like reformatting and conservation. And so this section of your assessment can include any plans that you might have for digitization, or maybe damaged items that need specific conservation treatment. And so in this section, there's also a couple questions that you can ask when performing this part of your assessment. First of all, do I have the funds to support a reformatting program or conservation treatment? And also, does my institution have the professional skills and ability to perform conservation or reformatting in-house? Or will I need to find a vendor or conservator in private practice? Additionally, do I have the knowledge and resources to sufficiently care for the conserved object after its treatment, or the digital files that are produced from my reformatting project? All of these questions are really going to help you assess the budget that might be needed, and if you have the in-house or out-of-house staffing that you might need for certain projects. Okay, so we can move on here to prioritization. I'd be happy though if anyone has any questions on the first two sections of our webinar here. If anyone has anything they'd like to ask, I can address any questions you might have thus far. We are going to get into some more nitty-gritty details, and hopefully at the end we should have time for questions as well. But I'm going to take a quick drink of water, and if you have any questions, feel free to go ahead and drop those into the chat. Okay, I'll go ahead and move forward with prioritization then here. All right, so with your assessment complete, it's time to gather existing documents and then prioritize the actions that you need to take to preserve your collections. So once we've completed an assessment, we can take the knowledge we've gained and make the recommended action lists of what we want to improve. Once these lists are completed, we can then prioritize how we can address those improvements. And so again, I know that this process can feel overwhelming at times. So as urgent as things might feel, or as much as we might want to, it's unreasonable to think that we can do everything all at once. We want to make sure that we spend our limited time, energy, and resources carefully. And so to do this, we want to try to break down our recommended actions into a few categories by asking the following questions, which we see here on the slide. And so, what will do the most for the least? And so, for instance, what is relatively low cost? And what are the things that you have the staff and resources to perform right away? One thing that we know is relatively low cost and high impact is creating policies. And so things like a collection development policy or a mission statement, or maybe an access and use policy that you use with your researchers. The biggest resource that policy creation often takes is staff and time. And we also know that there's many example or template policy documents that exist out in the world, which can make your job easier. So whenever we're talking about policy creation at NEDCC, we always like to emphasize that you don't need to create policies from scratch. These are things that you can find templates, and you can model your own policy document off of these templates that you can find on the web. A list maybe that you create from this question of like, maybe what are some things that are the most I can do for the least, or what are some policies that I can put in place? These can be your short-term priorities that you create. For a second question, you can ask, what will do some for a little? And so these goals tend to impact specific sets of materials in your collection. And so maybe it's upgrading your frame collection storage, or maybe getting some archival quality enclosures for a group of books, or maybe buying some nitrile gloves for handling photographs. Or maybe it's looking into low-cost ways to start an environmental monitoring program. And so the things that we identify here with this question, these are things that are often going to require some planning and some organization, and maybe some additional resources and staff time. And so these can be your medium-term priorities. As a last question, you can ask, what will do the most but will take a lot? And so these questions are these materials that you come up with here, these items, these are your big ticket items. And so based on the environmental monitoring you've done, for instance, maybe this will include upgrading your HVAC system, or maybe it's staffing that you're thinking of here and thinking of hiring a full-time or a part-time archivist. Maybe you've noticed some major renovations that need to be done, and you'd like to prepare a capital campaign maybe, and apply for some a matching grant. And so again, these actions are going to have will entail some sweeping changes, and these will be steps to be taken once your short and medium-term goals have been accomplished. And maybe these are also larger general goals that are going to require some major funding, or maybe some significant reorganization of resources. And so the list of items that you come up with when you're asking this question, these are going to be your long-term goals. We do see that there's one more question on the screen here. And so that is what will do little? So what will do little for your organization? And so regardless of cost, we know that some activities are going to have a very small impact on your collections, and they're just not going to be worth the investment. And so sometimes this can be, this might be counterintuitive. Sometimes this can be providing too much care to a collection. So maybe individually foldering or sleeving every single letter that you have, that takes a lot of time, but it isn't important as getting maybe, 15 letters into a folder and then boxing that. And so try to think about actions that are going to provide you with the most benefit and not have you bogged down in tiny details. And so just like our assessment process that we talked about, this isn't the only way to prioritize. You can also take a look at specific formats in your collection, or maybe think about the time it might take to implement certain actions, or maybe, thinking about if one action is going to lead to a slew of other actions that will follow it. Your preservation assessment and the resulting plan, It allows you to both take the time to perform a complete analysis of the many factors to be considered when setting your preservation priorities, and to order these in ways that makes most sense for your institution, your collection, and your resources. And thinking of your resources, when you're assigning your assessment observations into prioritized recommendations, don't forget to identify the resources that are needed. And so sometimes tagging each recommendation on your list with something like, this is free and quick and easy to accomplish, or maybe this is free, but it's time consuming, or maybe you can label something as expensive, but quick to accomplish, or simply expensive and time consuming. These will help you identify which activities to do first. It'll also, when you label your recommendation list like this, it's going to help you pick out the resource heavy recommendations that you're going to need to start putting on your administrator's radar early to get those done in the future. Thinking about the resources that you have available, it also helps you single out the activities that warrant a grant. So we know that grants can cover many different things, such as storage supplies, or maybe starting an environmental monitoring program, or even building improvements. And so NEDCC has a list of grants available at its free resources page, and you can see a link to that here on the bottom of this slide. I'll go ahead and pop that into the chat here as well. And one thing also not to forget is that another resource that you have at your disposal is staff knowledge. And so maybe establishing an environmental monitoring program is going to require some in-house knowledge that you don't have at the moment. And so it might be necessary to factor in some time that you might need to address any staff training that might be needed. So, for instance, there's always learning curves for different things. And so it's important to think about how you can either build that staff knowledge, or also think about, the institutional knowledge that might just exist in someone's head. And how can we get that out, by writing things down and providing training to other staff, so all that knowledge can be shared and developed. With so many likely preservation improvements to prioritize, sometimes it can be really helpful to use a chart or a rubric that can help even out the decision-making process that you might be facing. And so here we see NEDCC's implementation matrix, and this was adapted from Pamela Darling's book, Preservation Planning Program. It's a manual that she wrote. And so here with this matrix that we can see that high impact actions that can be implemented with little difficulty, they're placed high in the chart. You can see how the impact and feasibility ranges are there. And that's the high impact actions that can be implemented with little difficulty. That's going to be up in that upper left-hand corner there toward both impact and feasibility. Items that are difficult to implement and have little impact, that's going to go on the opposite side there in the bottom right corner, distant from both impact and feasibility. We know that if we're using this chart to aid in our decision making, actions that are ranked high both in impact and in feasibility, those are the things that should be pursued immediately, since they can be easily accomplished and will have significant benefits. The things that are ranked really low in the chart, say in this grayed out area that we have here, these are things that can often be postponed or maybe even disregarded because they achieve little while requiring great effort. In general, preservation activities that will have high impact, and so those can be things like improving your climate control, or rehousing a collection, or maybe reformatting at-risk audiovisual materials, and also are highly feasible. And so that you have the staffing, time, and money available to carry out those activities in the near future. Those are the things that are going to be the highest priority. Activities that are going to have a high impact but low feasibility. And so maybe that's something like, replacing your HVAC system. that's going to be given a lower priority until the circumstances make them more feasible. Last, when we think about actions that are feasible but only have minimal impact, these are things that may or may not be undertaken depending on the factors that you're facing, such as cost or visibility within the institution, or maybe the collections value. Okay, so we have made it through our initial planning phases here. And so now that you have prioritized the actions that you've discovered with your assessment, it's time to write your long-range preservation plan. So as we've noted throughout the webinar, there's several steps that you've already accomplished at this point before you write your plan. You've set up the groundwork for your plan by putting together a team and putting your planning on the radar of your board and administration. Through your assessment that you've completed, you've gathered your policies that you have in place, and you've also created documentation of your observations that you've made, and you've assessed different aspects of your collection, your building, and your storage. By now, hopefully, you have a pretty good hold on the tangible preservation activities that you want to start, as well as some of the broader concepts that you want to start integrating into your management and policies, and how these things are going to be prioritized. And so as we see here on our steps, we're now on step 3, which is writing the plan. We can see here a link to Sherilyn Ogden's Preservation Planning Guidelines for Writing a Long-Range Preservation Plan. This is a document that, as you can see, was written in 1998, but she's actually in the process of updating this. And so keep an eye out for it. She's hoping that it would be published sometime this year or maybe in the next year. So this can be, a book that might be really helpful for your process as well. So when you're writing your plan, you need to decide whether maybe a lengthy and more detailed plan is going to be most effective for your organization, or if a short and succinct plan is really going to better suit your needs. Regardless of the type of writing style that you choose to use, you can break your plan into the 5 parts that we see here on the slide. And so first, part A, that's going to cover your upfront information. And so that includes your title page, an acknowledgement section, an executive summary, your table of contents, and an introduction. And so here you're providing the introductory information to your preservation plan, showing the overall contents of the plan and the steps that were taken to execute it. These parts of the plan, especially your executive summary, it can be circulated to staff and board members to inform them of the state of preservation at your institution. It can also be used as a base for grant applications or maybe funding requests to strengthen your appeal and show justification for funds. And part B and part C, these are going to include your description of your collections and the specific needs and required actions for your collections. So in your plan, it's useful to provide an overview of the materials that are held in your collections. So readers are going to know the size and the types of collections that you have, their history, and their importance both as objects in themselves and to your institution. With this part outlined, your collection's preservation needs and required actions, part C that we see here, these are addressed in the context of your collection and as a whole, which is going to provide a really well-rounded picture of your materials and the steps that are needed for their preservation. When you're compiling the needs and required actions for your collection in part C, the assessment worksheets, your list of priorities and recommended actions, and the implementation chart that we've gone through, these things are going to come in very handy. And so when you're putting together part C, your needs and your required actions, you might consider reading through these documents and then highlighting the needs that you see in one color, and then the required actions for those needs in another. In your plan, you're going to categorize and list your specific needs and actions and make note of general priorities for those actions. And so again, this is where that prioritization comes into play. categories such as collection type or preservation need. Maybe so things, you'll categorize things in a way where you're talking about all the environmental adjustments that you need, or maybe the storage updates that you need. These can really help readers easily identify the scope of the needs that you have. And you'll later be able to group those actions into projects that can be completed together. We know here using a chart makes things very readable and easy to navigate. And you can include any contextual information that's needed, maybe as one of the columns in the chart that you lay out. And we're going to see an example of all these different steps in just a few slides. Sometimes I know it's really much easier to see a visual representation than to hear someone talk about it. So we'll see some examples coming up. Then when you have your needs and your required actions outlined, you can start to calendarize these actions into a specific time frame. That's going to create what we see in Part D, your institutional action plan and timetable. And so this might be the most difficult part to estimate, and the material that's most likely to shift around in your plan. But the good thing is that you have all of your needs and your actions listed, and also categorized, and then generally prioritized in the section above. And so making any changes that you might need to Part D, that makes that easier to manage. We know that the action timetable is the most important section of your plan. And so it's going to lay out your preservation future, and it lists all the actions required to preserve all of your institution's collections. It indicates which actions are the most important to take first, and it schedules these in the most effective way for achievement. Your timetable is really going to be your roadmap for preservation. And so it should give you the timelines, the needs, and the priorities for preservation of your collection, and will really allow you and your institution to have a comprehensive view of your preservation plan. Last, as we see here with E, your plan can also include a list of preservation actions that have been completed to date. And so this information can be especially important to grantors or administrators. It can help them see your commitment to preservation and the actions that you've already successfully executed. We know also that this list is going to grow as your preservation plan moves forward, and it gives you a good measuring stick to be able to chart your success. Okay, so with all of that said, let's go ahead and go through a few examples here and some sample plans. So hopefully these templates will be useful to you as you complete your own plan. And so here on the screen, you see a table of contents, and this is from the Minnesota Historical Society's Long Range Preservation Plan. And this is a really well laid out plan. I really highly recommend that you check it out. It's something that the entire plan is something that you can use as a template, and you can adapt it to your own organization's needs and things that you have happening at your institution. And so here you can see a table of contents. And so here you can see how we've kind of laid it out with what we were talking about with that part A of your plan. And so we have our acknowledgements here. This can be really helpful for transparency, especially when we're working with our administrators and our board of directors. We want people to see that we've taken a long time to really lay out this process and to take many different factors into consideration that helped us come to these conclusions of how we see preservation moving forward at our institution. When we make these acknowledgements and we say, you know, these are the people we worked with, this is the process that we followed, this is the timeline that we had, this is how we executed our planning, it really helps give confidence to people who are either, you know, our administrators or our grantors, to see that we took some really good time to think through this thoroughly. And these are our conclusions after going through all these different steps. This isn't something that we kind of just, you know, pulled out of thin air or thought, oh, these are things that have been going on for a long time, we really need to take care of this. With all these things acknowledged, we can see that we've really solidly planned and thought about our long-range preservation actions. Again, we have that executive summary and introduction, and then we can see here how they've broken things down into two parts. And so they've put their long-range preservation action plan and timetable first, and then they've listed their preservation accomplishments. And then part 2 is almost kind of like you can see those maybe as appendices, where you have your descriptions of the collections that you have, your summary table needs, and then they prioritize things in 2 ways. They prioritize their needs based on categories of need. And so this can be things like, environmental monitoring or storage. And then they prioritize things based on the collections that they have. So maybe these are, all of your AV collection priorities, or all of your book collection priorities, all your photograph collection priorities, things like that. Next, we can see a sample executive summary. And this is, again, something that's part of NEDCC's Preservation 101 course. And so I'll go ahead and drop that link in the chat as well. Again, all of these are linked either on your slides here, or there's a resource handout that's in that, that folder that I linked at the very beginning of the webinar. And so you'll be able to access these links again. And so here you can see what a sample executive summary entails. And so we, kind of give just like a general roundup of what we've done. And here are some of our short-term, medium-term, and long-term priorities. And this, again, is a really helpful one sheet that you can hand out to either staff who in the future may be executing some of these preservation projects, and also to your administration and your board, so they can get kind of the big picture of exactly what is happening with your preservation plan. Your needs and your prioritized actions. And so this is from the Minnesota Historical Society's long-range preservation plan. So here you can see the chart that they've made that talks about the specific needs that they're facing in the organization, recommended actions that they think should be executed to address those needs, the specific resources that are required to address those needs, and then they've made their priorities known. So you can see with this first one, this is improving environmental conditions for collections awaiting processing. And so you can see that that's the medium priority for them. And they've outlined that the priorities will be either high, medium, or low. With this one, you can see specifically that it's for their archaeology collections. And so you'll see when you look at their full plan, you in no way, again, you do not have to follow this exactly. You do not have to split it into, first we're going to prioritize everything based on collection type, and then we're going to prioritize everything based on our storage or our environment. You can do it in the way that works best for your institution. You do not need to follow these verbatim. These are things that are, you can use as inspiration to address the needs of your institution in the best way that you see fit. Okay, and then last here we see our action plan and timetable. And so we have this as well. This is going to be a document that is included in the NEDCC.org. Yours is NEMA Pres Plan. So again, make sure that you put that NEMA in there for that link. I'll go ahead and drop that in the chat again. And so you'll be able to find a document that has this chart for your action plan and timetable. And so here you can see this is a 5-year preservation plan. That is a sample for an organization. And here you can see the categories that they use and the way that they've outlined their timetable. And so they've created this calendar for themselves. And so here on the left, you can see they're going year by year. They have some, and they're organizing this by what they can accomplish more quickly, right? So here they have their policy development, developing a mission statement. What will be the measure of progress? So what will mean that this is, you've done some work on this and it's coming to its conclusion. And so here, completing the mission statement means that you've done that. And then they have a target date here. And so again, this is where, you can expect things to really shift around a lot in this organization or in this action plan. This is something where again, like I mentioned a few slides ago, your institutional priorities may not match up with your preservation priorities. And so this might be something where when you have this laid out, you really sit down and try to kind of parse that with maybe some people on your administration or department heads. How can we make these different goals line up? Maybe this is something that you try to incorporate into the strategic planning that you're doing at your organization. And so then that way, different priorities can start to come together and be aligned with the budgetary funding that you might be able to get and what your administration is willing to allocate in certain timeframes. And so again, this is going to be available in that NEMA Pres plan link that I've linked in the chat. And so with your plan complete, the last thing to think about is how do you implement the plan? We know that the time and commitment and the hard work that you've done writing your plan will hopefully make this a more seamless process. And so we know with many policy documents, they can often get shoved back into a drawer, maybe never to be seen again. But hopefully when your timetable created and the actions that you've identified, implementation of the plan will flow logically and smoothly from the writing process. To make your implementation even more achievable, consider putting someone in charge of implementing the plan. And so this might be an archivist on staff or a curator, or maybe it's a department head, or maybe as the person who came today, this might be you. And so ideally, this person would be someone who can work between staff and administration, has a sufficient understanding of preservation practices, and can integrate this task into their current duties. If you are the person who's going to be implementing the plan or whoever is going to take on that task, it should be seen as a job responsibility and ideally be treated appropriately, so incorporated into your job description. We know that implementation includes tracking the plan's progress and keeping it on schedule. It's also going to involve incorporating periodic evaluations of goals and expectations and making any adjustments that might be necessary. As always, with any kind of big projects that we're doing, communication is key. But it's also important to remember that preservation is iterative and it's about taking incremental steps in the right direction. And it's also important to really, celebrate those small steps, celebrate the successes that you achieve along the way. This plan is going to be needed to, it's going to need to be marketed to administration and the board if necessary, and also possibly to the public. And so with everything outlined in your plan, it's now time to advocate for your preservation needs and get the needed buy-in from administration or those who are in charge of the budget. And so as we mentioned before, the entire plan allows those who hold the purse strings to see the scope of your preservation needs and the justification and well thought out steps to completing your preservation goals. If additional advocacy steps are needed, sometimes maybe a behind the scenes tour with the plan in hand, that can really help administrators or department heads visualize and potentially visualize any kind of potentially difficult or hard to understand preservation needs. Sometimes it's good to just invite people down to your storage space and give them a tour and have your plan in your hand and point out the different things that you're seeing. Last, as with any policy, it's important to remember that your plan is a living document. And so over time, you're going to want to revisit your plan, ideally annually, and make any updates that keep the plan current and relevant. And so with that, we've gone just over a minute here. I'm going to go ahead and turn my video back on. I know that we've gone over the hour and some of you may need to leave, but I'm happy to answer any kinds of questions that you might have at the moment. I also want to point out that you can contact us with any questions you might have if you can't stick around. We have our email address, which is info@nedcc.org, or you can feel free to call us. And we also have social media as well, so you can feel free to call us there. So thank you so much again for having NEDCC, and it's been really great to be able to present this to you today. I can go ahead and stop that. stop sharing my screen as well.
Yeah, why don't you keep the screen up just for a second so people can
Okay.
keep in contact. But first off, thank you so much. We're completely grateful for your guidance through this really daunting topic. And thank you too to NEDCC for sharing, and for you for sharing those really, really instrumentally helpful documents through the group. We're completely indebted. At this time, I'm just going to echo Eli's call. If you guys have questions, I know we are pushing over the hour. If anyone has specific questions that they want to share anonymously, you're welcome to message me in the chat privately, and I will share those. But yeah, otherwise, please feel free to unmute yourself and say hello and ask your question.
Mm-hmm.
Getting a lot of thank yous in the chat. So again, Eli, very grateful to you.
Yes, thank you. And yes, I'm glad. I hope those documents are helpful. I know sometimes when we talk about this, kind of abstractly, it starts to become, how do I actually do this? So those documents are very, very helpful to, having a checklist, having questions that you answer. It's all makes the process a lot easier.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah, thank you, Eli, for sharing those. I've copied all the links. So at the end of this, we will send out the recording to all the people who registered, as well as the links for future reference.
Perfect.
So thanks for that. Yeah, thanks. So it looks like some people are ducking off. Last call for questions. No, I think we're pretty good. Well, thank you so much, Eli, for all of your wonderful information and insight. Good luck in your next endeavors, and thank you, Emily. And thank you, Emily, for organizing this wonderful conversation today.
Thanks, everyone. It's great to be here.
Yeah, thank you. All right, enjoy your afternoons, everybody. Take care, stay cool.
Thanks, Jen.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.